second unit as well would have to comply with that same standard.
Okay, okay, that's good enough. And then finally, or not finally, but at this moment, one more question. That is whether or not the conditions that we're talking about here, is that in compliance with county standards for roads, or?
They are asking for an exception to easement width, but otherwise, there probably is some deviation because roads, I think, will be going to, I think, maximum of 20%, but there are conditions to address that.
And these conditions do it comply with county standards then, or are they
deviate from the norm, but they're within a range that the county can.
Okay, okay, thank you. Thank you.
Supervisor Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 5 questions and areas of concern that I think will be both for the applicant and for staff. Let's go to staff first. I believe in your introduction, Mr. Lynch, you stated that one concern that was voiced in the staff report that you verbalized is that there is no long-term management plan for the detention ponds. Can you elaborate on that and why that's a concern?
Well, these ponds will be filled with water during major storm events, and they'll silt up, and they need to be cleaned out in order to function properly. There's, I believe, the applicant's going to address that or attempt to address that through a homeowners association, but I don't know if that's the best mechanism to do that.
So there's nothing that's been addressed specifically in the plan as presented to us today that addresses it, hence your concern?
Correct.
Okay. So that's one area. The second, I think this is also for Mr. Lynch. I'm looking at a letter from California Regional Water Quality Control, the North Coast region, written to Mr. Chatty in October, and the conclusion of the first paragraph says, the DND, the draft negative declaration, identifies potential significant environmental impacts of the proposed project and suggests mitigation measures to reduce the significance of these potential impacts. And it goes on to state a number of other things, including stormwater permits, water discharge requirements, and conditional waivers. Has the proposal, as we have received it, basically has regional water weighed in since this October date? In other words, do they still have the concerns that are voiced in this letter?
They have not weighed in since that date. The conditions that are provided for in that memo that's referred to and is within the motion for approval address a number of the concerns that were addressed in that letter. The overall, I think, the trend in project development is to make projects have a low impact to the land, to be sensitive to erosion and water quality that comes off the property. As I stated in our comments, I think the detention ponds do address maximum water flows. They do not necessarily address sediment control and water quality issues.
In terms of the infrastructure issue, I think it's this 16 versus 18. We've talked about the wells. Could you elaborate a little more, though, on that there aren't any hookups? I mean, I know from my position on LAFCO that issues are strained at best with respect to the Hopland utility district in the state and this whole scenario of permitting and moratorium and so forth. So it is your opinion now that there aren't hookups that could actually occur. They're sort of just on paper?
No, I mean, the hookups have been provided. We have a letter confirming that the availability of the 16 of the 18 hookups from the state. At the Planning Commission hearing, there was one individual who got up and said that he has an existing structure, he has an existing house, there's a hydrant outside his house, and during dry periods, I would imagine, he says that he's had very low, if any water, available to his home. I think there is a concern in general about water availability in the Hopland area. This project however, does have the blessing of the state for at least 16 of the 18 service connections. And I don't think, as I think Steve talked about in his comments, and I think other people have talked about, I don't think this project is going to solve the water problems in the Ukiah and Snell Valleys.
Right. Before we go on to the applicant, one question. What I find is interesting, and I think that there have been a lot of very good public comments in support of the project, but most of them seem to have a particular interest in the project, a financial one, if not a purchase of the property or working on the property. They all seem to be professionals. They all seem to be well-spoken, and the content that they brought forward and their support for Mr. Manning and the quality of the things he does, I think is very understandable. I don't have any issues with that. I think that clearly is the kind of project that would come forth. I still have some serious concerns about some of these components, some of which I've referenced. Another one, and I think what I was getting to is, Mr. Lynch, that I think it's interesting that I don't think I've heard it spoken here today, that this proposal was unanimously opposed by the Planning Commission.
Yeah,
and we don't have that information, and that hasn't really come forward, and yet we've got a lot of good public comments saying why they think all of these great engineering feats have been accomplished and project things have been addressed. But I find that Planning Commission decisions, usually those that are unanimous, usually come forward from a degree of analysis that the general public perhaps doesn't have, and they seem to be a very well-rounded group of individuals, and they come to their work from very different perspectives. So I do have concerns that the Planning Commission has unanimously recommended denial. Now, I'd like you to comment and give us some specifics on that.
I candidly am a little surprised that there wasn't some people in the opposition. If you looked at the Planning Commission minutes, there were people who showed up in opposition. I think that those folks who did speak talked about concerns about the amount of grading that has taken place previously in the property, what the amount of grading that will take place will result. They talked about concerns about the stability of the soils, the water quality, the retaining walls, the water availability, a plethora of topics that echo some of the comments made in the staff report. Why they're not here today, I have no explanation why. The Planning Commission, to the applicant's credit though, the Planning Commission, I think, did have some significant questions about the project. The Planning Commission discussed the desirability of having a site visit to further review the project and do some more assessment and have some response to address their concerns. The applicant at the hearing, I think, was concerned that they get the project on to this board to have the project heard, and did not want a continuance to provide for a site view.
Why not?
That's a question. That's a question you need to ask the applicant. But I think they wanted to get onto this board.
This board?
Yes.
Okay. That seems fair. But could you elaborate more on what you commented on the public, and you certainly don't know why the public wouldn't be present, but why did, more specifically, the Planning Commission unanimously vote to deny the project? That's kind of the
my read of the commission and being there was, I think they were frustrated because they didn't have an opportunity to site view it, and also I think that they ultimately agreed with staff that there was an inability to support the findings that are required to approve the project.
I still haven't finished.
Yep, let her conclude.
So to Mr. Gomes. Mr. Gomes, I was concerned about the sheriff's letter. I think that in other counties that have taken a more proactive stance with respect to providing infrastructure and a more detailed review of infrastructure, cover things like law enforcement. And I think that is germane to the issue that our Sheriff Almond, and one of his deputies signed, and then he retracted that. Could you be a little more specific? The sheriff didn't offer us. What is the applicant offering to provide with respect to this law enforcement? He alluded to a piece of property. Is that for purchase? Is that being donated to the county? Is it a lease? What kind of specifics are we talking about here?
Well, Ms. Smith, I wasn't there at this